Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And once again, we have a very special bonus episode for you with a very special guest. We're joined today by Sarah Chamberlain. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Suzanne.
So Sarah is one of the hosts of a part of our Scare-itage, which is another podcast here on the Megaphonic network. And on that show, she and her co-host Adam Clark look at the wild, wild world of Canadian horror films. It's a really delightful show. It's a must-listen for anyone who's interested in horror or in weird Canadiana. And so Sarah seemed like a perfect person for us to talk about the many, many Frankenstein adaptations that have appeared over the years. But then, Sarah, you mentioned to me that Frankenstein is like your favorite book ever.
It is my favorite book ever. You're right.
When did you first encounter Frankenstein?
I read Frankenstein when I was the first time I read it, I was in my preteens, and it was totally me looking for scary stuff that wasn't Goosebumps.
Did you read a child adaptation of it or the actual book?
No, the actual book. And at that point I was trying to find all of the classic scary stuff. Like I was the same probably month that I read Dracula for the first time.
And you weren't put off by all those letters from Walton to his sister, huh?
I mean, to be fair, the first time I read it, I probably understood maybe 30%.
But it captured your imagination. What was it that caught your attention? Do you remember what was the thing that first drew you in about that story? Chris and I were talking about the things that we had connected with when we first encountered it.
For me, I think it was definitely, at least that first time, there's a lot of stuff to reflect on in that novel. But it's also just this perfect kind of moody and just like fabulously gothic, and the atmosphere is so appealing. And I find that even now it's been really hard finding something that can kind of replicate that feeling.
Yeah, it's a very special voice.
Yeah, I mean, one of my or possibly my favorite author is Shelley Jackson, and she's one of the few who kind of touches on that atmosphere as well.
So what would you say is your favorite part of the novel?
Well, we can get into this when we start talking about the movies, but I will hint at and say that I think it's strange, but I think my favorite part of the novel is the subplot of the desire for a bride.
Mm.
And I mean, there's so much, I could go on and on about how I adore how gray area the novel is. Like the creature isn't your average sympathetic villain. But there's times when I pity both him and Victor, but also there's many times when I find them both completely insufferable.
Oh, yes.
And I love that about it. It's very you can't really pick a side because both of them have so many cons to their character, and they're both so self-pitying and stuff. So it's great. But that subplot is I think the one thing that really stands out for me, and I can't wait to talk about it. So
Now, one more question before we start talking about it. Had you seen the movie or any of the movies before you read the novel?
No, actually, the novel was my first experience with it.
Wow.
So I think that kind of changed the way I viewed the movies. How about you guys?
I had not seen any of the movies, I don't think, but I'm sure I'd seen TV shows that referenced it, other types of pop culture where Frankenstein, I'd had Frankenberry cereal.
Yeah, there's all those pop culture references. And what I had seen actually was a very bizarre thing. I had seen the cheesy yet strangely fascinating 1973 Michael Sarrazin vehicle, which was a sort of a TV version that was memorable for the fact that the creature started out beautiful and became hideous over time.
Oh.
And strangely, that image has kind of stuck with me.
And yeah, that's the thing, is I think it's almost completely unavoidable from an early age for any child to not experience a Frankenstein-esque storyline in some capacity. I'm sure even, I joked about Goosebumps earlier, I'm sure even Goosebumps touched on it, or, the cartoon for Tales from the Crypt, all of that stuff. So it's hard to say when the first experience is, but a full-on movie, yeah, I think it was definitely after the novel.
So one of the things that's interesting about the movies, I mean, we tend to think about a lot of the ways that we conceptualize Frankenstein as coming from the 1931 Boris Karloff movie, the classic Frankenstein, which established a lot of the tropes about what Frankenstein looks like and how the story beats go in our minds. But one of the interesting things is that those movies weren't adapting the books so much as they were adapting stage plays that had come out. And do you know a lot about the history of the stage plays?
No, not exactly. Like, I'm curious to hear. I do know that an Igor-esque character was first introduced on the stage, and has become such an iconic part of the Frankenstein story, because as you both know, he's not in the novel at all.
Yeah, I had completely forgotten about that until I started looking up the movies. That that we didn't mention the lack of the Igor character as something that makes the novel really unfamiliar.
Definitely.
But yeah, by 1823, 5 different versions had already appeared on the London stage.
Wow, that's so fast.
And that is the year when Richard Brinsley Peake's Presumption comes out. And that's the one where we get a lot of these tropes from. It's the one where we have Victor Frankenstein as the mad scientist, where the creature can no longer talk, and where we have the Igor lab assistant character. So that's been around from 1823, which is, even before the final revised version of the text. And I don't know a lot about this history, but I know that some scholars have pointed out that the book actually didn't have nearly as broad a circulation as the plays did. So people have always thought about Frankenstein through these kinds of visual performed depictions of it, which I find really interesting when returning to the novel.
Definitely.
But yeah, this all gets reflected in the early Frankenstein movies. Have you seen the 1910 Frankenstein?
It's only a short film, and I've seen only clips of it and a lot of imagery. The interesting thing about the 1910 film is my favorite visual depiction of the creature is from that movie.
Oh.
So I caught it while I was doing some research. I didn't know anything about it until yesterday, and it's on YouTube. You can just watch it. It's about 14 minutes long.
Oh, wonderful.
It is a really fun depiction of the creature.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about the sort of the actor or the maquette during the creation scene?
Both. Yeah, because for me, one thing that I think this is my hot take, is that there is that the creature himself is very much something that can only be portrayed through the written word. I think that like no visual medium can really do him justice. And I've never been satisfied with any version of it in a movie, kind of understandably. The way he's described in the book it's so minimalistic, and it's just supposed to be kind of this extreme level of horror that's just kind of indescribable.
Well, we only get the descriptions of him in this very oblique kind of way. It's Victor's repulsion at what he's created. It's the creature's own repulsion at the sight of himself.
Exactly.
Right? It's not any objective kind of view at all.
Which is great, because it's like you as the reader are envisioning what it's whatever is the most horrifying thing you can imagine, which is so specific to every individual. And the 1910 version isn't what I think he would look like, but what I like about it is that it's gritty and it's unpleasant to look at, and it's very inhuman.
Yeah. So the 1910 film, it's very streamlined. It's only 14 minutes long, and it mostly serves as a vehicle for showing off some special effects. There's a fantastic creation scene, which is just Frankenstein looking into this kind of box in which the creature is coming together. And how they do the effect, as far as I can tell from watching it, is that they've made a doll of the actor playing Frankenstein, and they set it on fire with a little puppet string so that the arm can move, and then they reverse the footage. And it's such a clever effect, and it looks really remarkable for a 1910 film. The pieces of the creature just sort of, instead of falling off like they would in a fire, they come up and they'll clomp onto his face.
Wow.
It's really remarkable.
It is, and it's still it's still haunting.
It's also interesting because that also plays into the history of the stage versions of Frankenstein, which I've been learning also largely were excuses to have fantastic special effects. And a lot of the technologies of special stage lighting and stage effects that were being developed in the 19th century used Frankenstein as an excuse to display what they could do now.
Yeah, kind of showing off those effects I like that.
It's interesting to think about how Frankenstein, which is a story of technology gone wrong, also becomes a vehicle for showing off these special effects. We should move on to the 1931 Frankenstein, which I finally watched today. I've never actually seen it.
And what did you think?
I think it's a very interesting movie, and it's a very well shot movie in a lot of the scenes. Like, there are some absolutely stunning black and white cinematography in that movie.
Yeah. I rewatched it for this, and it's still visually stunning. Like, it's not something that, it's just when you're a kid, maybe it will look nice. Or, back in the day, I'm sure that looked great. It's actually still holds up quite well.
Yeah. So what changes did they make in the 1931 movie? Or what do you see when you're thinking about it in comparison to the novel?
Well, it sounds like now that you've given me a little bit of a history on the plays, it sounds very much so like they kind of established the setup for pretty much all of the future movies. There are a couple adaptations that kind of try to relate to the book a little bit more, but this one is very much like the plays you described. The creature is this senseless being that is just an infant, but not in the way that he is in the novel, where he can actually learn and take in things. He's just kind of lumbering around, and I mean, Karloff gives a great performance, but it's also silly.
It's very tableau-like in some ways, isn't it? Like some of the scenes in the 1931 film really give you that sense of like being sort of set visual pieces. And I wonder if that's coming from the theatrical history behind it.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. It's great that you point that out, because I definitely noticed that too. There's some scenes where it's so visually stunning. And then there are some where it's like, this is so definitely a set. Particularly the graveyard scene, if you remember that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It looks like someone just put a camera on a stage play, but it's still great. It's just like, it's very distinct.
You mentioned that the creature, now the monster, doesn't seem capable of learning anything. But he also, in this version, doesn't really get a chance to. He's not set free to wander around and see the family and learn language that way. He's kept watch over at all times.
Yeah, it's very different, where I'm curious as to why. I suppose they thought that this was more horrific in a sense, this kind of creature kept in this dark place secretly that, it could be happening anywhere. Like, he's not wandering around the world, but he sees this isolated being that is kind of too horrifying to let loose into the world. And then, of course, the end of the movie shows you exactly what happens when he is. But what I enjoy is that the movie that comes after this, which is The Bride of Frankenstein, just a couple years later, he gets a lot more time out in the open.
Well, before we turn to that, one last thing about the 1931 Frankenstein, you have the scene with the little girl, which is very famous and was at the time very controversial because they had to make some last minute edits to the movie to make it viable for the public. But he meets a little girl and she is not horrified by him, which is the opposite reaction from when he approaches Victor's younger brother in the novel,
right,
where he's immediately horrified by him. She's completely accepting. She has the innocence of the child that the creature is in the novel expects of the young boy.
It almost mirrors his own innocence in the ways in which that scene plays out.
Yeah, and so they play with flowers for a while. She throws the flowers into the lake. They float. He runs out of flowers, and he looks for something else to throw, and then he throws her into the lake and drowns her, which doesn't seem to be the effect that the monster was going for. He seems quite upset that he's done this, but he doesn't really know what to do about it. It's also just interesting that apparently just the few frames of him actually throwing the girl are what got cut out from the original release. They've been restored. They were restored in the version that I saw. But
right,
it's such an interesting take on that scene from the novel, the way it just flips it around.
Yeah, it is interesting, and they definitely in the movie try to portray him more as just this innocent and definitely not cruel the way he becomes in the novel. Except at the end, I guess you could argue, when he's the whole windmill scene. But that's just rage.
Yeah, and he's panicked by fire, and they're burning the mill that he's in down. Like I don't
think
know.
anyone would have that reaction, to be honest.
Absolutely, totally understandable.
Yeah.
So I also got a chance to watch Bride of Frankenstein for the first time today.
Look at you! You went through them all.
Well, I went through those two anyways. And that was also very interesting. It was as if after having made a big success out of Frankenstein, they decided to read the novel.
That is a perfect description.
It adds a lot of extraneous material in, but it's engaging with a lot of the same issues that Mary Shelley seems to be grappling with when we read her.
Oh, and right on that point, she's actually narrating the movie at the beginning.
Yeah. Yes, there's a marvelous frame tale that I'm very sad they don't return to at the end, but there's a fantastic little weird scene of Mary and Percy and Byron sitting around being ridiculous parodies of
They're
themselves.
So great. It's got so much camp to it, this movie.
Oh, it does. It really does. It actually made me laugh at one point, which was a surprise. But the woman who is playing Mary Shelley is also the woman who plays the Bride of Frankenstein,
which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a lovely symmetry.
So I don't know how well either of you, or how many horror movies either of you have seen.
I have not seen many at all.
Suzanne?
I'm a connoisseur of the Dr. Phibes movies.
Oh, nice. Okay, but is it safe to think that you've perhaps seen the Evil Dead series?
No.
No.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Well, I just, the way the Frankenstein movie with Karloff, or the original Frankenstein movie, leads into this movie is it's a direct sequel, but which is unlike Evil Dead 1 and 2, which it's kind of, Evil Dead 2 is almost a remake of the first one. It's kind of a sequel, kind of a remake. But I compare it to that because it seems to take what the original movie had and stays kind of similar, but it's also almost a farce of the original movie. And you kind of see that with The Bride of Frankenstein. It's got some serious moments, but it's also got a lot of more goofiness to it.
Yeah, I mean, and you get that fairly early on with Millie, the hysterical old woman who's really excited about the fire, really excited about killing the creature, doesn't want to leave the site of its death, and then is the one who discovers that the creature is still alive and tries to tell everybody. And she just keeps popping up in the movie, being ridiculous and over the top. She's marvelous.
Yeah, and there is the one lady who tries to help him out of the water, and then he just gets out and then throws her directly in. And it's this wonderful, like, prop. It's so good.
Yeah, no, the body falls in a remarkable plonk kind of way. And then you also have the character of the other doctor, Dr. Pretorius, who's also been working on creating life. Who's been taking we'll talk about his scientific approach in a moment, I guess, but he's also played in this very arch way.
Yeah.
And he delivered the line that actually made me laugh. There's a scene early on in which he offers gin to Frankenstein, I believe. And he says, "Oh, it's my only weakness." And then 20, 30 minutes later, there's another scene where he offers a smoke to the monster. And it's like, "Oh, it's my only weakness." I was like, oh, nice callback. Of course, you're the kind of guy who has every vice as your only weakness.
Exactly. No, that's a really good and kind of like, it's not like a dated sense of humor. There's some jokes that could still work nowadays.
So he's a new character to this development, or I guess he's vaguely based on the professors that Victor Frankenstein works with in the novel. But he's going about creating life in this completely other way by sort of developing it from seeds, by trying to mimic nature as opposed to reviving something from the dead, by trying to grow something new. But it hasn't been as successful in that they don't grow very big.
And Mary Shelley, when she's narrating at the beginning, she says that the character that she created for the first novel was a man daring to try his hand at being God. So this kind of mimics that, but in a completely different way.
Yeah. I didn't know about this scene. Like, it wasn't one of the familiar scenes that has been passed down that, you just know because you've osmosed it through pop culture. But the scene where he's revealing his little homunculi, these little creations, these characters in a jar. First off, the special effect holds up. Like, that looks good.
It does. It's surprisingly good.
And I just had no idea that it was there. I don't understand why more people haven't talked about or recreated this scene. It's remarkable.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a lot of talk of remaking Bride of Frankenstein and a few attempts that have just kind of flopped before any progress was made. But I think you're right in saying that this type of thing is something that they could recreate, and it could definitely work.
So this seemed to touch upon the thing that you enjoyed most in the novel.
Yeah, and what I enjoy, as you mentioned this earlier, is that it actually does try to follow the novel a little bit more, like scenes where the creature comes across some people that react badly to him, but then he meets a blind man who takes pity on him and it tries to teach him some language. He only learns a few basic words like friend, but it definitely tries to be a little more similar.
It's striking, though, that it completely leaves out the, extent to which the creature becomes eloquent in the novel, right? Doesn't just learn the rudiments of language, but becomes a fully realized human being on some level, right? It's so interesting that doesn't make its way into the popular perception, I think.
It very rarely does. One of the only times I've ever seen a Frankenstein adaptation where the creature is his own character and isn't just a monster of sorts is, have you heard of the TV show Penny Dreadful?
No.
Okay, it was a TV show that was based off of a bunch of different horror literature lore. As you probably know, Penny Dreadful was like a cheap, kind of like tasteless article comic back in the day that would, always be kind of horror related. So this series has the whole Frankenstein plot point. It also has the Wolfman. It also has possession. It kind of covers everything. And the Frankenstein plot point is the creature has like a huge, very sympathetic arc that is similar to the book, which is quite in contrast to, as you're just saying, in movies like this, you're lucky if he gets even a little bit of the development that he has in the novel.
Yeah, we were talking about in the episode that Susanna and I did on this book about how much we enjoy those scenes in the novel where he's learning language, where he's encountering the world and is so articulate in how he relates that to us.
Yes.
And it is nice to get a few of those scenes in this movie, but it doesn't really flesh it out to the degree that I wanted to see. Does the Penny Dreadful adaptation really go into that?
Yeah, you know what? Based off of what I heard you two talking about on that episode, I think that you might actually really enjoy that adaptation. It's a little more melodramatic, I suppose. It is a TV show, but and it only lasted 3 seasons. So if you want to dip your hand into it, it's not too long, but it's so much closer to that. And he is definitely like kind of a very not black and white character. He sits in the gray area a lot because he's very vengeful, but he's also like self-pitying, and he's very obsessed with the idea of finding someone more like him. And it's really into the language and him like studying literature and learning from the literature he reads.
Excellent. Well, I probably should check that out then.
Yeah.
The other thing about Bride of Frankenstein that I appreciated was, well, first off, I didn't know how Bride of Frankenstein ended.
Oh.
I knew the bride was created, but I didn't know that she rejected him. And so when I was talking in our episode about the weird assumptions that the creature was making, that should Victor create a partner for him, that the partner would just go along
exactly
as she does in Paradise Lost. It was interesting to see that my suspicions that no, probably that's not how that would work out were parlayed. And it was interesting that that was the route that they chose in this movie, that they didn't just give the monster the bride, which is sort of a lot of the time how women are treated in movies.
Yeah. And you know what? We're on the exact same page there. I think that's what makes me like this movie. And I think a lot of people actually, the reception for this movie was even better than the original, which is rare for a sequel. And I think it has a lot to do with that ending scene, because despite the fact that the movie itself it's even campier than the first one, that ending scene it's sad. And it's visceral, and it really kind of gets you and makes you realize like exactly what you said, which is why that part of that subplot in the novel is my favorite part. Is they don't really touch on it in the novel, but I've always thought, just as you said, that even if she doesn't react with horror the way she does in the movie, which I think is great, why doesn't he believe that she might just react with a desire to be her own person? Or what if she's just not able to love him? Like, what if she even tries and she can't? So there's so many elements to him having this person who he thinks would just be an empty slate, kind of under his control, that he could manipulate and shape to his own needs. It's like there's so many other options for who she would have become, and this is just one of them.
You brought out so much there, Sarah. I keep thinking about, the extent to which the creature in the novel, his knowledge of the story of Adam and Eve and, the primal story of couples is Milton's Paradise Lost, right? Where Eve, at first, when she sees Adam, she's like, ick. She's like much more interested in going back to look, in the watery surface and see how pretty she is, right?
Exactly.
And it's because this other voice leads her through the garden to embrace Adam, and he reaches out and sort of takes hold of her. And so this is the story that the creature knows, right? So his universe is set up in a way where this imagined mate is someone who might have to be constrained to come to him. And I'm not saying that's all there in the Bride of Frankenstein movie, but there's a couple things going on, right? Like, yeah, we can understand it in terms of her autonomy and her making that choice not to go along as everyone might expect she would, not least the creature. But also, it's just that she's horrified by him, right? She's repelled by him. And it's sort of poignant to think of his endless optimism, right? And there's so much continuity between the optimism there and the optimism he has in the novel when he thinks the DeLacy family might be his friends, right? These lovely people.
Exactly.
But just rejection is his lot, right? Over and over and over and over.
Yeah. And I can't help but perhaps wonder, especially in the novel when he seems to have a little bit more, urgency as a person, unlike the movies where he really is just kind of this sympathetic, almost pathetic being, if it's not a little selfish to think that everyone around you should like you.
It's also a little selfish at the end of the movie, the monster destroys himself, Dr. Pretorius, and the newly formed bride. Seemingly, at least. That's certainly the note that the movie ends on, but we've known that he's escaped fires before. I know that there are sequels to this movie or extensions to the franchise, and I don't know whether they do another one of those movie serial, didn't really die, snuck out at the last minute kind of moves.
Which was very, it wouldn't be shocking for that time. That happened quite frequently in movies.
Exactly. But it does seem like the movie is trying to convince you that it's perfectly okay that he is killing the bride along with himself because they are all abominations and that's the right thing to do. But it also seems brutally unfair that she doesn't have a choice in this, but she's only been alive for a few minutes. She's barely got her bearings.
Well, exactly. Yeah. It's actually, her story is the more tragic one, which I suppose is why the title even might be named after her, despite her only being in the movie for a total of 5 minutes.
Well, she's anticipated throughout the movie, right? So she's only present for a short period, but she's kind of imminent, so to speak.
Very true.
For a lot more of it, right?
Yeah, and I guess like his whole goal in that movie is trying to find someone who will do that for him.
So we might want to move on to some later adaptations of Frankenstein. There were many more in the Universal Monsters series and many other Hammer films and things like that made, as I understand. But I think we were thinking that we might want to talk next about Young Frankenstein, a very different take on these movies.
Suzanne laughs because that's your pick, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's real popular, right? I mean, and it's a movie that is doing a couple different things. One, it's very funny, right? But it's also assuming that you know those movies inside and out, and it's can effortlessly play with those tropes and count on you being right there. And that's kind of neat. So it's a parody in the sense that it's following step by step so many of those set pieces. And so part of the pleasure in that film is the fact that it's echoing things we know, echoing visual cues and plot points that we know. But it's also like a lot of Mel Brooks's movies, I think, often doing something very subtle, like almost in kind of political terms. Blazing Saddles is even more that way. Movies that are also saying certain things in Young Frankenstein. I think about German culture and about Jewish identity and about race and about, in a very comic way, saying things that are otherwise could not be said explicitly. So I think it's a movie that's, it's hilarious, but it's also doing some very serious things in a very subtle way.
Yeah, it definitely does. And this is a movie that I haven't seen since I was a little kid. And that was because my father was so obsessed with Mel Brooks. I think I saw every Mel Brooks movie 100 times. But yeah, this one definitely, I think, even hammered home some of the tropes that are still associated with Frankenstein nowadays. I think it had a lot to do with this because like comedy tends to really kind of help characters like an Igor stick in the mind. In the Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein movies, he's never Igor. It's Fritz.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I believe it was the movies with Bela Lugosi as quote unquote Igor when that name was first coined. But I really think it was, I wouldn't be shocked if the Mel Brooks movie is what kind of really got that character into people's subconscious.
Yeah. I'm sure you're right about that. Hard to forget Marty Feldman.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic performance.
It is. The other thing that the movie does that's kind of, again, like harks back to the novel, I think, in ways that, as far as I know, don't show up in the movies. It reestablishes a friendly and affectionate relationship between Victor Frankenstein and his Frankenstein and his creature, right? Because they develop this like deeply affectionate, they perform a dance together at the end. It's ridiculous and comic, right? But the close affection, right, brings them together. And ultimately they end up exchanging, bodies and minds, right? They end up having this kind of exchange at the end where body parts are swapped so that they're kind of bound together as almost like, I don't know, assemblages of one another. That's way more serious than anything Mel Brooks would ever say about that film. but it's doing things that recall the novel that I don't think are, at least not in the standard repertoire of, visual culture, movie culture that lies behind Young Frankenstein. So in some ways it's like a throwaway, playful kind of movie, but I think it's actually doing some very interesting things.
Yeah, I can't agree with all of that.
I've seen Young Frankenstein a few times. It's a very funny movie, and I always get excited when it's available to watch when I'm on a plane. But I hadn't seen the actual Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein before. So there were a few times when I was watching those movies today when I finally got the jokes.
Oh.
I didn't know about the brain switcheroo in the original Frankenstein. So the whole scene where Abby Normal gets pulled out. Like, obviously I got that joke, but the fact that that is referencing something from the original movie, I never knew.
You gave me an abnormal brain.
Which is great that that's even in the original movie because it's such a silly moment and it works so well in this version of it instead.
It's a very silly moment. And I always wonder whether they needed to do that, whether they needed to, in that original movie, whether they needed to show that this is a criminal brain, that it's, he's doomed because of the brain that was chosen, not because of anything else. It seems to undercut some of the potential messages of it.
It really does, I think. And I was thinking the exact same thing when I rewatched the first one. It's like it definitely seems to take away a lot of the contemplation that you could have. You're just kind of like, oh, it's an evil person, therefore a wild creature.
It takes away all the potentiality of the creature, right? And it makes him doomed by the nature of his body. And it's not a reach, I think, to see that in the context of 19th century theories of phrenology and 19th century race theory. I mean, again, not to get heavy, but that's the kind of backdrop there.
But it's also interesting in the Mel Brooks movie because now we've got this Abby Normal brain and the creature is a delight and he's a weirdo and he's meant to be sort of treasured in this. And when he encounters a little girl, it's fine. Like, they have a lovely day. And he's much more of like the Muppets ethos of we're all a bunch of weirdos gathered together.
And that's true. It kind of rectifies that original thing where it's like, no, it's fine.
Yeah, Mel Brooks has a vision of the world in which the monster fits in just fine.
Wow, best adaptation. You've convinced me.
Well, you might need to rewatch it, I suppose. So, Sarah, you had proposed another Frankenstein adaptation to talk about, which is more recent and which I didn't, maybe I'd vaguely heard of it, but I don't really know anything about it. Do you want to tell us about it?
Sure. I picked this one because there are so many, as you both are aware, an almost uncountable amount of Frankenstein adaptations in some regard. And a lot of them can be pretty similar. I picked Frankenweenie, which is, despite the silly name, it's a stop-motion animation by Tim Burton, and it's based off of one of his earliest works. And then just a few years back, I believe it was 2012, he decided to make it a full-length feature. And not only is it just a visually stunning movie, it's beautiful, the stop-motion is perfect, it's all done in black and white, which is super unique for like a movie nowadays, let alone for children. And it's great because it's totally the story of Frankenstein, but adapted for children and with pets instead.
Yeah, so I watched the trailer for it. It looks like now it's a young kid, it's a young boy who is going to be reviving his dead dog.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And that's the Frankenweenie. Yeah. And did I catch the joke right? That the dog's name was Sparky?
Yes.
That's really good.
And there's a character named Shelley. Like, it's definitely not shy about what it's doing.
So what does having it be children acting out the story allow it to do or change about the plot?
So it definitely is a little more lighthearted, but as is most Tim Burton stuff, it's still pretty macabre and I think would definitely be scarier for a younger audience. I just think it's a wonderful example of how to make horror safe for children, which is great because, and this is something I'd love to hear both of your opinion on, is like, do you think stories like Frankenstein and classic horror in the vein of that should be introduced to children? Should it be, kind of adapted in a way that they can experience it? Or should they just experience it for what it is?
That's a great question. But before I attempt an answer at that, I'm curious all right. So I'm somebody who doesn't go to horror. I don't turn to horror. And I know that you very much do, that horror is like many people, for you, horror is a very important nurturing source of, I don't know, you can tell me what it nurtures you with exactly, I suppose.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, it's a favorite. It's important, but it's important to you and it allows you to feel things. And you were on an episode of This Is Your Mixtape, another Megaphonic show recently, where you were talking very nicely about what seeing horror meant to you and how that is kind of a place that you can go to and how you recognize that that's not true for everybody, but how it's been very important to you. What is it in horror that you want to make accessible to children?
I believe that if especially experienced at a younger age, things that can be a little bit scary, and this is where I believe the question comes in, is should it be scary, or should it be kind of fun scary like this movie is? I think this is a good example of something that I think children should see, because not only is it a movie that deals with death, which is a huge concept for children, it deals with it in this fun, in a kind of fun way, but also a way that it makes it a little scary, it makes it a little okay. And I think that children kind of being not subjected to that, but experiencing that might help them kind of be ready for it's scary things that could happen later on. And not even real life scary things, but it's almost impossible to avoid like scary moments or even just scary media and stuff. So it's like experiencing at a young age, I think, can definitely help prepare them for that. And yeah, movies like this are like it does it in kind of like an exciting way.
That's a really interesting and good point. And I don't feel like I'm at all qualified to say anything on this. This isn't how I've experienced scary movies or how I came to deal with those kinds of feelings and emotions, but I could totally see how that would be valuable.
Yeah.
Suzanne, did you have any?
Well, yeah, no, as you're talking, Sarah, I've been thinking about my own experiences growing up with horror, and then also, raising kids and thinking about, well, what was their introduction into horror? I find horror movies really hard to watch. So I'll watch ones that are beautifully made and have something really going for them. Like I went down to TIFF to see The Shining a couple of days ago, which I had seen before and like really almost wet myself. It's just horrifying, but it's a beautiful movie. So I got, or Psycho or whatever. Yeah. But I read obsessively tons and tons of horror short fiction growing up. I love that stuff. I read just volumes and volumes of it because there was a level of control, because you could put the book away. You could, the control was different. So I read, at first a children's version of Edgar Allan Poe stories that was a little bit, accessible to like an 8 or 9 year old, but that was the gateway for me. I mean, and then I went and found real Poe, and I just went down that path really energetically. And it did give me something that was valuable in the ways in which you're describing it. The other thing that comes to mind is watching horror as a family. Like, one of the things that, cause I have 4 kids, right? And some of them are pretty close in age. And, we only had one TV, and it was always in the living room, so that, people could watch as much TV as they wanted, but you had to negotiate what you were watching. And the result was that if one person was watching horror, everybody was watching horror. It was a communal activity. And if you're going to be scared, being scared in a cluster, like in a little pile of other kids, is enormously helpful. And it gives you something, it gives you a kind of strength.
I think you really hit the nail on the head there, because I haven't really reflected on that before, but I think the sense of community, it does play a part in this. But you also mentioned reading horror, and I too was obsessed with reading, especially short fiction. Mm. And I still to this day think that is the scarier way to do it.
Oh, yeah. And just parenthetically, I have to say, the most terrifying experience of my entire life ever was reading Red Dragon, which was a kind of prequel to Silence of the Lambs. Did you ever read that?
It's a great story, yeah.
I read that late at night, all night till about 4 a.m. And then I was going to go to sleep right beside my partner and our infant child. And I was like, could not sleep. My eyeballs were open until dawn. It's like, even now, exactly. It gives me a chill. Yeah, that's the worst thing ever.
Yeah. And I think that's a curious thing too, is it better to kind of experience the story of Frankenstein through a fun cartoon that's also kind of scary, or is it better to just read the book? I personally would say that the books would probably be 10 times scarier, mm-hmm. Even though it's not exactly a scary story per se. It depends on how active your imagination is, I suppose.
Yeah, I certainly agree that having the Frankenstein myth as a kind of trope that you can see the world through, you can understand things through this story of somebody who created something and then it went awry. That seems like a really useful metaphor or a really useful myth to have in your head as you investigate the world. So I can certainly understand wanting to give that to children. This is all very interesting. Again, it doesn't really match up with my sense of what horror is or how I've experienced it. When I do watch horror movies, it is usually in a group situation. It is usually because Adam or somebody is making me watch something, but and it's usually fine. But also they tend to be movies that I don't find scary, I guess.
Right. They're kind of more funner. You're with people, you're probably drinking. Like it's definitely like a different kind of atmosphere.
Yeah. They're either very campy, silly movies with like really fake blood everywhere, or they're very serious movies that are, like Godzilla, the original Godzilla, which is a beautiful movie that Adam made me watch. And I'm glad he did. But at no point was anything particularly scary. It was just interesting. It's just cool and beautiful and interesting and moving. which I'm fine with. I would never have thought of it as a horror movie necessarily, although I can see where that argument is coming from.
Exactly. That's what I think is so great about horror. And I know we don't have like loads of time, but the book Frankenstein, it's like I could go on and on about how that could be considered horror to some and absolutely not scary at all to others. And I think the movies are the same.
Before we wrap up, let's talk about a few movies that aren't necessarily adaptations directly of Frankenstein, but nevertheless carry a lot of echoes of it. And I bring this up because, Suzanne, you had a really interesting take on the Terminator movies as being a kind of Frankenstein heir.
Well, I think, how can I put it? When we talk about the visual culture afterlife of the novel Frankenstein, on the one hand, we're talking about these Frankenstein adaptations that we've been talking about together today. But I think that book, along with other things, but that book in particular spawned ranges of ways of thinking about what it might be to be not quite human or sort of human or superhuman or subhuman in ways that inform an awful lot of some of the assumptions we have today. So like in the novel, the creature is described as being of superhuman stature, but he's also made up of human body parts as well as things from the slaughterhouse. So he's presumably got an animal nature as well. And so this kind of weird parallel to regular humanity seems to be something that we see in a lot of different places. And so that was one that led me to start thinking a little bit about a lot of our contemporary science fiction, but the Terminator movies in particular. But the other thing that was making me think about that film is the weird family plot, the weird genealogies of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The Terminator movies do that in spades. So, in the book, there's all this weird sort of interchangeability of the different women and so on. Like there's this very strange kind of how people are related to one another in ways that Chris and I talked about last time. And in the Terminator movies, I don't know if you remember, in the first one, John Connor is, how can I put it, almost brings about his own conception, right? Like John Connor of the future has a good friend named Kyle. They have a kind of a big brother, little brother kind of relationship. And then Kyle is sent back into the past in order to protect John Connor's mother, Sarah Connor, who Kyle has fallen in love with because he's seen a photograph that John Connor has and John Connor gives it to him. So, how can I put this? John Connor is the older brother of his own father in some weird way, right? And that strange it's a really weird plot, right? And then that gets amplified in the second Terminator movie when John Connor in the future reprograms the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? The Terminator 800, and sends him back in time, and where he will then assume a kind of quasi-paternal role to the 10-year-old John Connor. So John Connor has, as it were, fathered in the sense of sort of reprogramming, right, in a technical, artificial kind of way, the Terminator, who will be a father to him, 10-year-old John Connor. So John Connor is at once the 10-year-old and the older man, right? He's almost his own grandfather. And so it's this weird kind of homosocial, male-dominated, very strange family relations in those two movies that, to me, resonate in a really powerful way with the weird family plots of the novel. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's crazy or not. Like I tell this to people
Not
and they're
at all.
like, wow, really? I don't know.
No, not at all. I think that's like, as soon as I heard that was an idea of yours, I was like, yeah, I started thinking about it and I'm like, there's so many parallels. Like, whereas Frankenstein kind of touches on the issue of humans ignoring questions of morality just to see if they can do something that they probably shouldn't be doing.
Miles Dyson, right?
Yeah, exactly. Terminator 2 is possibly more focused on like humans ignoring common sense to see if they can do things that they shouldn't be doing. But both failures are achieved through like a relentless pursuit of trying to advance science.
Yeah, what they call in the novel, penetrating the secrets of nature, right? Yeah, don't do that.
Exactly.
And also, one other aspect, we were talking earlier about the creature's capacity for intellectual and emotional growth, which is super important in the novel and then gets wiped out of the Frankenstein movie tradition, right? He becomes this childlike, incapable, very limited creature. In the Terminator movies, there is growth, right? I mean, and that's one of the key elements. So it's not a Frankenstein adaptation, the Terminator movies, but they're doing something that's responding to that novel in a funny kind of way.
I love that you just changed those movies for me.
Before we head off, are there any other particularly outstanding, weird, exciting Frankenstein adaptations that you want to tell us about?
Well, there is a Canadian one.
Oh, good.
But I've never seen it. I don't know enough about it. perhaps Adam and I will tackle it one time on a part of our Scare-itage.
Oh, yeah. What's it called?
I can't even remember. It's Frankenstein on campus or something, and I'm almost certain. I'm almost certain it's like filmed in Toronto.
Oh, wow.
So,
There is a Dr. Frankenstein on campus. Yep, it's filmed in Canada.
Oh,
beautiful.
Tell me it's filmed at U of T. That'll make me so happy.
Adam knows for sure, but I'm not as knowledgeable in this great movie.
It's from 1970. It was filmed in Toronto.
It has to be U of T.
Well, probably in 1970. I don't see anything further about that. We will have to investigate more, and I'm super excited for you guys to tackle that.
That's so fabulous.
And I wouldn't be shocked if it ends up being the weirdest adaptation, as Canadians tend to do.
The tagline on the poster, it's got traditional Karlovian Frankenstein monster with a mortar on his head, and the quote is, "When I'm president of this university, there will be no murder, no violence, no drinking of blood. In fact, I'll be the only student."
Magnificent!
Oh,
brilliant!
That's amazing. That's excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming and talking movies with us today, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Oh, I honestly appreciate this. Oh, no problem. And thank you, guys. This was so much fun. And yeah, any chance to talk about my favorite novel and a bunch of horror movies. So it's great.
Wonderful. Well, if you, dear listener, want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. And you can catch Sarah's work at a part of our Scare-itage at megaphonic.fm/scare. Show notes with links to anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/9b, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. But until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.